We are in Luke's Gospel today, the 10th chapter, which marks the beginning of Luke's travel narrative. Now, if you were here last week, I hope you'll benefit from a little redundancy. I'm going to repeat some of what I said last week. And if you couldn't be here last week, then I hope you'll benefit from hearing what I'm about to say again this week. Remember that the way that Luke's gospel is structured, the beginning of his public ministry is in the region called Galilee. Galilee is where he called the original 12 disciples. And Jesus and his disciples go out into this region called Galilee, and they preach, they proclaim, they tell about the kingdom of God, and they heal people on behalf of God. And this all takes place for about 5 chapters, so well into the Gospel of Luke. And then we're now in chapter 9, verse 51. So we've had the beginning, the birth of Jesus, and then we've had his ministry in Galilee. Now we're in chapter 9, the 51st verse, and Jesus, it says, will set his mind to go to where? Jerusalem. So from this point onward, Jesus is headed to Jerusalem for that last week of his life, where he will complete God's mission for him on this earth, God's saving work in and through his death and resurrection. And so the beginning of Luke talks about Jesus' ministry in Galilee, and then it will end in Jerusalem. But that area, that time in between, is what it's referred to in Luke's gospel as the travel narrative. And it's about 10 verses long. So it takes up a lot of space, the travel narrative does, in Luke's gospel. And it's during this time that Jesus is trying to teach his disciples through parables, through lessons, through show and tell. He's going to spend all this time in the travel narrative really honing in what it means to be a disciple, what it means to follow Jesus Christ and to help usher in God's kingdom. I think it's helpful when we think about this travel narrative to look at a map. So I'm going to show this map like I did last week. Now, in the northern region, you'll find what? Galilee. In the southern part of the map, in Judea, if you look closely, you'll see the town of Jerusalem. But in between, in the middle, I called it the messy middle last week, what do you find? What region? Samaria. Now, not all of the travel narrative, sometimes I get checked on these things after the service is over. People come up to me, it's like, well, did you know this? And you didn't get this right. So I want to be clear. I'm not sure that all of the travel narrative takes place in the region of Samaria. Maybe sometimes they're on the border. I'm not sure. I didn't study it that closely. But by and large, what I want you to understand is to get from Galilee to Jerusalem, you have to go through where? Samaria. That's right. Now, you may remember from last week, we were in Luke chapter 10, the first 11 verses. And that was all about Jesus commissioning the 70 others. In addition to the 12 disciples that he calls in Galilee, now he's going to commission 70, some translations say 72, to go ahead of him, to pave the way, to provide a little buffer and break the ice. Jesus is going to go into this region of Samaria, but he wants these 72 to go ahead of him. And remember what he tells these 70 disciples. He tells them, I am sending you out as what? Say it like you mean it. Come on. Lambs among wolves. Now, the reason he says this is Jesus knows he's sending these people to proclaim God's kingdom. He's sending them in hostile territory or an unfriendly region. Now, I was reading a book a commentary by Amy Jo Levine. She is Jewish, and she is a New Testament scholar. So I think that provides a unique perspective. And she says that the Samaritans are not meant to be pitied here. They weren't less off nor better off than the Jewish people of that time. That's not what needs to be emphasized here. She says what the emphasis needs to be on is that they were enemies, generations after generation. They had been at odds with each other. They didn't like each other, and they didn't trust each other. And so, by the way, the word good, in the entire parable, if you read it closely, even though in the heading it's there in some translations, in the parable, the Samaritans never called good. We've just over time, attached that name to the parable. But my point is, for these first century listeners, as they're paying attention to this story that Jesus is telling them, and they are hearing about what this Samaritan is doing, they're thinking this can't be possible, because there would have been nothing in their mind that thought that a Samaritan was good. In fact, Samaritan equaled B-A-D. What does that spell? Bad. Thank you for listening and paying attention. Now, Amy Jill Levine says, I think this is kind of radical, but she does have a unique perspective being Jewish. She believes that it's not too far-fetched to think that some of those first century listeners, as they're listening to what Jesus has to say in this story, they're thinking to themselves something like, I would rather die than let a Samaritan help me out. But we all know that's not how the story goes. The parable of the Good Samaritan, travel narrative, is the first parable. He calls the 70, they're on their way. This is the first parable that Jesus is going to tell about Christian discipleship in the entire Lucan travel narrative. And you know the story. It's about this man, and he's traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho. And while he's on the way, he is attacked by a group of robbers. And they take all his clothes, and they beat him up, and they leave him half dead. Luckily, there's a priest that is along the way on the same road. But what this priest does is the priest goes to the other side of the road and doesn't help out the victim. But then another priest, a Levite this time, shows up, and this Levite avoids the victim as well and doesn't help out. And it would have been unbelievable. This would have blown their minds that a Samaritan, of all people, a Samaritan will show compassion. This Samaritan doesn't do, and I think you were so prophetic, Parma, in your children's sermon. This Samaritan doesn't do what I might have done, being really busy and focused on my job. I might have just, handed him a snack bag and pointed him to the nearest hospital. This Samaritan does, though, what so many of you, I won't be able to name you all, but I do want to name some people. This Samaritan does what so many of you in this church do day in, day out, because I watch you. This Samaritan does what a Rebecca Kershaw Burnell would do, or a Richard and Louise Sadler, or a Jenny Cooley, or a Penny Bice, or a Kathy Dalton, or a Mike, Dave, and Ken. This Samaritan, like so many of you in this church, doesn't just show compassion. The Samaritan goes out of his way to show compassion. It's really odd in this parable that it would go into so much detail about what this Samaritan does. First of all, he has compassion for the victim, the wounded man. And then he goes up to him, and he offers first aid. He tends to his wounds and bandages them and puts on some kind of salve. And then he provides transportation. And Jill, we know how inconvenient that can be in the middle of the day. Takes him to an inn so that he can rest and recover. And then the next morning, This Samaritan gets up and he pays in some kind of payment of his choice. He pays for the guy and he says to the innkeeper, I'm going to go away, but when I come back, do whatever you need to do to care for this person, and I'll settle up when I return. The Samaritan, of all people, this Samaritan does what God does. The Samaritan extends and shows extravagant mercy. There's a professor by the name of Tom Long, the Reverend Dr. Tom Long. And he is the professor emeritus of homiletics, which just means preaching, at Candler School of Theology in Atlanta, Georgia. And he has taught preaching at this seminary, a United Methodist seminary, by the way, for many, many years. And one of his favorite classes that he taught for decades was on the parables that we read, Jesus' parables that we read in the four Gospels. He's written a new book. This book was published in 2024. I just recently, over the summer, bought it, and I've been reading it. And as I was reading it, I was prompted, as we are these days, to go to YouTube and watch any videos I could find by Tom Long where he preaches on the parables. And several weeks ago, I already knew, because this is a lectionary passage, I knew I was going to be preaching on this story, and I heard him tell a story in light of our parable today that I just can't put down. You ever had a story like that? It so resonates with me, it so brings home this parable that I thought I would share the story with you to end my sermon. But don't think my sermon's about to be over, because it's kind of a long story. It's a personal story that he tells about growing up to go and visit his grandmother, who lived in an antebellum home in the town of Due West, South Carolina. I'd never heard of it. So I looked it up on the map so you can kind of get an idea where it is. I also looked up on Wikipedia how many live today in Due West, and they currently have a population of 1,216 people. The Reverend Dr. Tom Long grew up going to visit his grandmother in Due West in her antebellum home. And in that home, there were two living areas. One was more formal. Sometimes they called it the parlor. Now, I know y'all know what a parlor is because we have one here downstairs. And this was a bit of a stuffy, staid kind of room. It even had an austere kind of feel at times, very formal. And it was not lived in much. It was reserved for those special occasions, like, for example, when the preacher came to visit, or when there was a funeral and they needed a place to receive people, or when there was a small wedding or wedding reception. Again, it was reserved for formal, special occasions. The other living area, his grandmother called the sitting room. I might call it the den. And this was a warm room. This is where people spent most of their time, and they could be much more relaxed. Tom Long was a little boy remembering a visit there, and he remembers on the wall of that sitting room there being around 20 to 30 family photographs and portraits, all displayed on the wall. Everybody from like his great-great-grandparents, grandparents, parents, aunts, uncle, cousins, children, you name it, they were all displayed on that wall. But in the very middle of those photos was something rather odd. It was a black and white photo of a man, a portrait of a man in an oval frame. Tom Long remembers asking his grandmother about that picture. What's that picture all about? And she said to him, when you're old enough, I will tell you. A few years passed, and now he's right around the age of 11 to 12, maybe 13. he remembers going back to his grandmother's house in Due West, South Carolina, Antebellum home, for a visit. And they were in the sitting room together, alone. And he looked at that odd picture again, and he asked about it. And she said to him, "Okay, I will tell you all about it," she said. His name is Joseph Twitchell, and he was a chaplain in the Army of the Potomac, a Union officer. Can you imagine how odd that would have been? Picture of a Union officer in an antebellum home. And she went on to say he was a young man and soldier, and after the Battle of Williamsburg, when all the troops had left, leaving all the dead behind, this young man did what was his custom to do, and he got on his horse and he rode and toured the entire battlefield. He was looking for any wounded who may have been abandoned. And he found this 18-year-old Confederate soldier who was dying in a ditch. He'd been shot in the leg, and he was bleeding to death. And so the officer, he was a chaplain in the Army, he reached down and he put him on his horse, this wounded man, and he took him to a nearby hospital, Union Hospital tent, and they amputated his leg and saved his life. And Chaplain Joseph Twitchell raised money so that he could send this soldier home to his family safely back in South Carolina. And Tom's grandmother said, "This 18-year-old soldier was my father, your great-grandfather. You and I," she said, "would not be here today without Joseph Twitchell." When the enemy becomes the redeemer, Jesus says, God's kingdom breaks in. And at the last part of the parable, as he wraps it up, in this first parable of Luke's travel narrative, Jesus says to anyone with ears to hear, "Go and do likewise." So be it, and so it is.